Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where for the past few days I've been working on a TARDIS interior ranking video. This has taken me a very long time to do and I hope you all enjoy it. It's a follow-up to my sonic screwdriver ranking, which is now out of date, which is quite funny. But yeah, this took me a while, so if you could do me a favour and subscribe if you're new and you enjoy it, that would be greatly appreciated. But with that said, enjoy the ranking. In 14th place, we have the secondary console as used by Tom Baker. Now, I'll be completely honest, the room on this one is nice. I like the glass-stained window, that's really nice. The room itself is quite nice, the exit way is quite nice. Really, the only thing that lets this one down for me, and the reason it's at the bottom, and it's kind of a deal breaker for me when it comes to console rooms, is the console itself. It's so small, the buttons are lacking, they're basically just tappy keyboard buttons and very little else to actually do on this console. I think it makes sense as a secondary console room. The issue is that this was used more so than the Pyramids of Mars version, which we'll get to in a sec, which I would argue is a significantly better console room for Tom, and just in general. I think it just ends up looking a little bit cheap with how little there actually is on the console in the end. In 13th place, quite fittingly, we have the 13th Doctor's console room. Now, I've spoken at length about this console room. To be completely honest, I've never liked it, and I was glad when it was ditched for this new era. My main issues with it are as follows. I think, first of all, it's very cramped feeling. Again, kind of similarly with the wooden console, but obviously a New Who equivalent of that. The pillars kind of make it feel enclosed and kind of small feeling, and I mean, they've even said in behind the scenes material, I'm pretty sure, that they struggled to use the cameras in that set because of the pillars, which just kind of shows that this design was a little bit too, I guess, messy is probably the word I'd use. I've never really been a huge fan of the roundels. They've always kind of reminded me of like car tires. The console itself has very little distinguishable buttons to it, often as well because of how it's lit, but as I said in my previous ranking, part of the important thing to me with any TARDIS console room is the distinctiveness of the console and being able to see what buttons you're pressing and pulling and all that other stuff, and you really can't see that with Jodie's. The only ones that really stick out to me are the big lever she pulls to make it go, and the spinning TARDIS top thing, which is cool. Bonus points to this TARDIS console room though for the box incision for this console room. I quite like that, the way you step in through the box. That's quite nice. I also feel that this TARDIS really lacks a homely aspect to it. At least with the secondary, you can make the case that the wooden stuff made it feel quite homely. With this, it's so empty, and I mean, in scenes where the companions are talking, they're often resting up against the pillars, which looks really uncomfortable, and I don't think anyone would organically have a conversation like that. Overall, I've just always found it cramped and a bit ugly, to be honest. I mean, the crystals have never been a big turn on for me either. They've always reminded me of kind of a Superman cave aesthetic. The whole aesthetic being a dark sort of thing doesn't really fit Jodie either. When you think of Jodie's Doctor, you think of quite a bubbly personality for the most part. So here being in a dingy cave never really made any sense to me. Like, that makes sense to some extent with something like the Eccleston Tennant console that's supposed to be post-Time War. The Doctor's going through a lot. It's grungy for that reason. That makes sense. The 11th Doctor even said, it's his grunge phase, he grows out of it. With this, though, this is supposed to be a Doctor of new hope and new optimism, and she's given a TARDIS that's like the complete opposite of that. It doesn't feel right. I feel like one of the things that matters to me with console rooms, as well as just how they look aesthetically, is how they fit their respective Doctors. And I never really felt that this was like right for her somehow. I do like the little Gallifreyan engravings on the sort of platform. They're quite nice. But yeah, overall, this console room's never appealed to me. I will say, I do think it looks slightly better in different colours, specifically the blue, and I want to say Nikola Tesla, and I think maybe Revolution has it, and when it's in distress, in red, I think they both look better than the standard yellow colour that they go for. Also, I think this is definitely lit the worst in Series 11. It feels really desaturated and weird looking. Series 12 has the opposite problem where it's like overexposed to high heaven and they just dial up the saturation to like 500. It's like so colourful to the point of it being quite like a sore on the eyes. Series 13 I think is where it looks the best. I've seen some people compliment the fluxy cobweb aesthetic, which does fit the cave thing, although again I don't really feel it fits this Doctor particularly well. But at the same time, I will say I probably do prefer it in flux than I do in the rest of the show, just because at least there it feels like the TARDIS is part of the story and that like it's decaying along with the flux. But yeah, overall, this is definitely, by far for me, my least favourite modern console room by quite a margin. Not to say that there wasn't effort put into it, you can definitely tell that there was. It's just not a design that I really click with. It feels like an attempt to recapture the Eccleston Tennant one, and I'm already not a massive fan of the Eccleston Tennant one, as we'll get to, but all of the narrative justification for that console room, as well as the distinctiveness of that console room, is kind of lost on this set for me. So yeah, that's why it ends up with such a low placement. In 12th place, we have the Pertwee console, specifically the fishbowl one. Now, as I said in the intro, I tried to truncate the classic console rooms a little bit because I felt that I just end up ranking a lot of similar console rooms, so I didn't include things like the Three Doctors console room, which is essentially just the Hartnell one, but in colour. But I did want to include this one because it does have some key differences, mainly being those fishbowl lights that I mentioned in the beginning. I'm not a huge fan. This is a Season 9 console, Joe Grant. I'm not big on it. Other than that, this console doesn't really do anything that offensive. I mean, the console itself is fine. It's just kind of a standard classic one. It really is just those kind of lights that really turn me off. That's why it goes above 13's though, because where I don't like 13's kind of overall design aesthetic, with this it is just a case of one aspect of it really not working for me. But it's a case of that one aspect really kind of drags down what is otherwise fairly solid, fairly standard classic console room fare. I just wish they'd have gone for some different light. In 11th place, we have the console room as used in the later years by Tom Baker and Peter Davison. This is kind of what I call the proto-80s console room, essentially the one before we get to the Five Doctors console room. And it's used in stories like Earthshock, for example. And yeah, I mean, it's not bad. I do like the room. This is where you get introduced to the kind of pillars on the roundel walls, and I love a good roundel, as you'll see as we go down this list. But I think ultimately, my one issue with this console room isn't even like that big. It's just, I think that console being inside it just looks, it's always looked a bit cheaper to me than the later 80s alternative. I don't mind the black paint, however, I do think it clashes slightly with the very white and sort of grey room personally, and I probably do prefer the more grey aesthetic that they go for with the 80s console. It's not even terrible, it's just nowhere near as good really, that's my ultimate thing. I will give it this, you could make out all the distinct buttons on it fairly well, so it gets points for that where perhaps other consoles have faltered. You can see like different dials and things like that. So that's good. This is probably, so far at least, probably the strongest console on this list. My ultimate issue is it's not even that bad. It's just that that room looks significantly better with another console in it. In 10th place, we have, again, rather fittingly, the Eccleston Tennant console. Now, I feel like this might be slightly controversial because there are a lot of aspects that I do like about this console. As I said, it's reflective of the post-Time War grunge phase of the Doctor. So you've kind of got this aesthetic of it kind of being cobbled together by different parts. And whilst that's not my ideal TARDIS aesthetic, I do at least appreciate how distinctive all the buttons are. You've got like bicycle pumps, and you've got big levers, and you've got a bell and a hammer and all the rest of this stuff that does feel like the Doctor's cobbled this console together, which is a fun aesthetic that it commits to. However, it's not my ideal aesthetic. It does feel a little bit too grungy for my personal taste in TARDIS consoles. It does get points for having chairs in them, although I'm not sure why the chairs look like that. I get the idea that the Doctor's probably just taped them together, but it does get points for having chairs. The coral beams, I don't mind. Really, it's just the colour and kind of the dirtiness of this console that I'm not big on. It's really that Wilf clip where he says, I thought it'd be cleaner. That's me when I think of this console, you know? But it does get points over the Journey one for A, I think the scale of it is better, and B, as I said, the buttons and switches and all the rest of it are way more distinctive than they are on the Journey console. I will say, however, this is one of those cases where I actually think the TARDIS, it looks better when it's dimly lit in this case. Whereas that was one of my issues with the Whittaker console in some scenes, I actually felt that it benefited this console somewhat. I think when it's like overly lit, it can look a bit too sitcom set-esque. Overall, this design is very 2000s. It comes very much out of that like sort of sci-fi realism kind of era where everything had to sort of be grounded and earthy. And it works for the time, it's just not what my ideal TARDIS would be now, and I'm glad we've kind of moved on from that aesthetic. That's the one thing I don't want with future TARDISes. I don't want that organic feeling. I think it worked at the time, but I don't think it's ever really worked since this, and I think later consoles do a much better job of feeling like time spaceships to me. In 9th place, and I feel like this might upset some people, it's the War Doctors console, the John Hurt 50th console. That might be controversial to some because it's essentially just the Tennant one, but in white. I just think there's something really nice to me about the blending of the early New Who aesthetic with the classic Who aesthetic. It's a lot smaller than the Tennant console, so it does get some detracted points for that, but it does make up for it with the round things. I love the round things. And again, I just prefer the colour overall. And there are some minor tweaks made to it. For example, the screen looks a lot more battered and a couple of the controls look quite different. And I do think it fits the aesthetic of the War Doctor and kind of the purpose of the War Doctor very well. Kind of this in-between zone between classic and modern Who, which is very much what John Hurt's Doctor is supposed to represent. And I think he looks really good in it. And I mean, that's the same for the Eccleston Tennant one, don't get me wrong, but I don't know, I just really like the kind of blending of all these old and new aesthetics. I think it kind of fits the TARDIS quite well, kind of having this blend of different eras. I think it works. I always see this one at the lower end of lists, so I kind of wanted to give it some credit in this video and say I actually quite like it. And like, it definitely feels like what a Time Lord would use if they're going to war. It's very grungy, there's wires all over the place, which I actually really like. It's really nice. I like it as an aesthetic a lot. In 8th place, we have one of Tom Baker's earlier consoles, specifically I remember it as being the one used in Pyramids of Mars. I really like this one. It's essentially like about as classic as a classic console room can get. It's all white walls with roundels that are white, and you get a very white console in the middle, and I think it works. The main detractor for this console is just that there's not a lot else going on other than the console itself. The room is quite plain, which is fine. I don't really mind that very much. I think it works in this case. And it doesn't feel cramped either. When you go inside it, it feels like there's enough space for him to move around in. One of my issues with the secondary, and to a lesser extent, the kind of later Tom Baker console, is that it does kind of feel like he has to squeeze around it, whereas with the Pyramids of Mars one, you never really get that feeling, at least in my opinion. It feels like it's got enough space to breathe. Other than that, though, there's not a lot else to say about this console. It's just a really solid, plain, classic-looking console. I like the time rotor, and that's also used, I believe, on the later version of the Tom Baker console, the kind of red one. I like that. But yeah, it's just solid. In 7th place, ooh, now we're getting into the interesting ones. We have the first Smith. Admittedly, I will have some level of bias towards this, is the Smith era is very much my childhood era of Doctor Who, which I realise might make some audience members feel old. My apologies. But what works for me about this is that it really blends in with the fantasy aesthetic of the Smith era. It kind of reminds me of an Escher painting with all the different staircases. I love the sense of scope to this. The glass floor is a really nice addition. I love the fact that the Doctor can go downstairs and start tinkering with things below the console. That's really nice. There's a sense of real scale to this console that I like. The colours are really nice, they're vibrant. This is shot really well in certain stories. Particular highlights for me are Amy's Choice and The Doctor's Wife. I think it looks fantastic in both of those stories. The console itself is really unique. It does sort of have that cobbled together nature of the Tennant console, but it's less grungy to me. It's more kind of, it reminds me of something Willy Wonka would create, if you know what I mean. It's kind of that great glass elevator kind of aesthetic, with the kind of retro pull-down monitor and the big sort of almost casino-like lever where you're about to win like a big prize. I like the circular monitor on the copper. The copper in general I quite like. I would say that this console's shapes are a little hard to define in terms of like the way the room is shaped, which you might see as like a downside to it. And I'd also say I still do generally prefer a more clean and towerless look, which is why it's not like higher than this. But for me, I significantly prefer this to Tennant's one. And I'd also say it fits Matt Smith very well, who's a very athletic and kind of manic Doctor. It's got a bunch of things for him to press and kind of spin around in, and it very much fits his style of piloting a TARDIS, which is very kind of frantic and almost like he's doing ballet with it. I think it fits him very well, which is, as I've said, a factor of consideration for me. In 6th place, we have the Fugitive Doctor's console. Now, this one's an interesting one because it's very similar to classic console rooms, but at the same time, it kind of has that kind of John Hurt effect that I was talking about, of blending modern design elements with a classic console room and ending up with something really nice. I really like the sort of metal structures that kind of hold the console room together. It has basically just the 60s console ripped directly from it, which is not a bad thing in the slightest. That console was the same for so long for a reason, because it's fantastic. Colour-wise, I really like that it's more blue. I think it fits this TARDIS really well. My only real criticism of this is more the way it's shot in some scenes with those weird lens flares, but that's more of an issue of the era itself than the console room itself. I like the walkway being kind of this big thing with roundels, really like that. It feels modern yet retro at the same time in a really cool way. I like the screen, the big screen to the side. My only real criticism of it beyond that is that we didn't see more of it. Personally, I kind of wish this was the main console instead of the 13th Doctor's. I think this is a much stronger design, and I think, because we see in the Timeless Children as well, basically this console room that gets used in different colours, and I do feel like this could be one of the more kind of multi-purpose console rooms, which is another factor I haven't really spoken about to this point, but we will get to that when we cover some of the later ones. I think a TARDIS really shows that it's a good TARDIS if it can be used in multiple different scenarios with multiple different incarnations with relative ease, and I definitely think this is one of those ones where with just some new decorations and change of colour, it can completely change the aesthetic of the TARDIS and would fit a new Doctor completely. As it is though, it really does kind of fit the Fugitive, having this very classic vibe while also feeling, again, a bit like War Doctor-esque, a bit like, ooh, this is almost like a spaceship deck where she discusses her plans. I think that really works. You've got kind of that glass area that's very similar to what you have with the original Hartnell console that's really nice. I just wish we saw more of this one, to be honest, is my main criticism of it, is that it was too fleeting, and I'd have loved to have seen more of it. In 5th place, we have the 80s console room, which was the one used all the way from, I think, the 5 Doctors all the way till Survival. Essentially, the quintessential, in my opinion, quintessential 80s console room. I really, really like it. Again, you've got that sort of pillory thing going on from the earlier Tom Baker console, but the real star of the show here is that console. Now, I will say, it is incredibly of its time and incredibly 80s. However, that doesn't stop it being remarkably charming for me. One of the things I love with this is the time rotor. The time rotor being kind of this pyramid. It looks so nice and so fancy looking, and I really, really like it. I feel like of all the consoles, this is the one that I imagine would be the most scientifically kind of accurate, in the sense of the TARDIS probably would just be a mass of buttons that don't make any sense to any sort of human eye, but to the Doctor they make perfect sense. That makes sense to me. I get that it's probably for some people not as visually engaging as even something like the Hartnell console that has a lot more variety in terms of its buttons, which is why it is below that for me. However, there is just something so charming about this. It's the fact that it is so 80s, all the little screens on it. Yeah, I really, really like this one. I don't have many complaints about it. It's really, really nice. But I can understand why some people have preferences for others if you're not big on the keyboardiness of this console, which normally I wouldn't be, but I think there's something so charming about it given the time in which it was used. And that was number 5, so we're now in the top 5, and now we can really start to talk about the TARDISes that I absolutely adore. And in 4th place, with no exception, it's the Smith second console and, more prominently, the Peter Capaldi console room. The Toyota, as it's been effectively referred to, I love this one a lot. Once again, you kind of have that sense of scale with the underbelly of the TARDIS as well as the different levels. This TARDIS, like most people say, is definitely better with Capaldi. With Smith, I don't actually mind the blue lighting, I think that's fine, but the orange, the bookcases, the chalkboards, the workstations, it all just looks so homely and so perfect for Capaldi's Doctor. It's a mature TARDIS, and I think it works really well for his Doctor. I like that it feels like a modern spaceship whilst also not feeling too alien. Like, it still feels like an old guy lives in it, which makes sense. The buttons on this TARDIS are, they're exquisite. They're absolutely wonderful. They're so distinctive. Like, you've got the big opening levers that are the red ones. You've got the main lever that Peter Capaldi presses is, you've got the handbrake, you've got the weird telepathic circuits things. This console does very little wrong, in all honesty. I do kind of wish that there was more movement that was visible for the kind of dematerialization, because you see a little bit of the pincers going in the time rotor, which, yeah, that's another thing with New Who consoles, is that they have the sky-high time rotor. With the exception of 13s, they mostly go up to the ceiling, and I like that here. I actually really like the kind of clock aesthetic as it's turning. I think that's really nice. Really tastefully done, the Gallifreyan symbols on the top of the ceiling. Really, really nice. Yeah, this one's really good for me. I just prefer the others on this list slightly more, which I know might shock some of you, but the next 3 are really, really solid. In 3rd place, we have the Hartnell console. And with this, I kind of bundle in any kind of variations on the Hartnell console we have. So that's like the 3 Doctors, Twice Upon a Time, all of that. This is just my placement for that original design and any variations thereupon, so things like Adventure in Space and Time as well. I didn't want to include this console as a bunch of different variations that would just clog up the list with very, very minor differences, because I felt like I just end up repeating myself a lot of the time. But this is just the classic. Again, it has that Capaldi quality of feeling like the home of an old man. You've got the globe, you've got the clock. The console itself is a beautiful piece of 60s design, simultaneously not being too elaborate, but also feeling like something out of an alien craft. Weirdly, despite the fact that the 60s is known for kind of having like wobbly monsters and stuff, this set never felt wobbly to me. It always looks really, really sturdy and impressive looking, which is a feat considering the time in which it was made. This is the TARDIS that essentially all others are trying to emulate going forwards, and you have to give it credit for that. The TV monitor is actually really nice, really charming. I love the light on the top that's kind of that hexagonal shape. The only place where you really feel the budget restraints is with the paper roundels, but honestly, I find them kind of charming at this stage. And you've got to give them some credit. This was 1963 on a BBC budget. The console is perfectly scaled with a lovely, lovely time rotor. I love the fact that even this early on established that there are different routes to TARDIS and different features. Obviously, more often than not, this console wasn't seen in its full glory because of space and trying to fit other things in the studio, but nonetheless, it always looks fantastic to me. And no other TARDISes would exist today without this first one, so you've got to give it some credit. In second place, I actually can't believe that something's finally dethroned it after all these years, but we'll get to that. It's the TV movie console room. Oh boy, this was by far for the longest time my favourite console room ever, and I still absolutely adore it. What I love about this console room is, it's exactly what I imagine a time machine would look like. It's kind of got that Victorian steampunk H.G. Wells type of quality to it, but it also has that homely aspect to it that I love in TARDISes, you know, the sort of chairs and the bookcases and the little vial of jelly babies that he eats from. The console is absolutely fantastic. This is one of the few that I've actually managed to see in real life when I was very, very young. All the buttons are distinct. It doesn't feel like there's too much going on. Doesn't feel like there's too little. It's a really, really nice blend. I love the doorway, the massive doorway with the big Gallifreyan symbol at the top. The opening roof that shows all the stars, the constellations. That's absolutely beautiful. This was by far the biggest console room to date at the time it came out, and has only been beaten by what is my number one choice. It was also the very first to introduce the sky-high time rotor, and it's probably one of my favourite kind of incorporations of it. I think this time rotor looks really nice. You can still very much see the movement, but also it has a new sense of scale to it. I really like the sort of metal scaffolding to the sides of the console. They all look fantastic. I know some people can say that they find it a bit too like Dracula-y with the candles and stuff. Personally, all that works for me. They probably do over-egg it a bit with all the clocks because it's a time machine, especially in the opening of the film, but I just can't help but feel that if I was the Doctor, this is the TARDIS I would spend the most time in and just chill out and just enjoy listening to that record that just says the word time over and over. Yeah, this is a beautiful piece of design. For the longest time, I believe it was the most expensive one. I don't know whether that's still the case, because we don't really get, numbers on consoles. And it was also one of the only ones not made by the BBC, which I just think is kind of funny in hindsight, given it's so high up on this list. But finally, it's time to get to number one. And I had to deliberate on this for a while because it's a new edition, and I never thought a new addition to this list would make my number one so quickly, but I genuinely believe it does. It's the 14th and 15th Doctor's console room. Number one, the scale of it is huge, which I know some people prefer a smaller TARDIS. For me, the bigger the better. It shows really well the contrast between the smallness of the box and the hugeness, the vastness of the inside. It's got all those different corridors leading to different pathways, which gives the TARDIS a real sense of scale, which I was really lacking in the Whittaker one. I know they did add some corridors later on, but by the time they did, it felt quite small. This feels huge, like it just goes anywhere and everywhere. One of the main kind of features of this console though that really makes it is the colour changing LED roundels. I was talking about how the TARDIS has versatility, and if it's a good TARDIS it should work for various different incarnations, and that's definitely the case for the Capaldi one, but even more so here, as those lights can change individually to literally any colour the Doctor desires. So this could be used theoretically, forever. The console itself is really, really nice. It's kind of got this thing where the room itself is really clean, but some of the buttons have kind of got a bit of a rustic steampunk thing going on, which I already said from the McGann console I absolutely love. All the buttons look distinct as well. I can pinpoint exact things even this early on. It's got a nice little small monitor on it, as well as a big sky monitor, which is going to be used but hasn't been used yet. And that's another thing with this console. What excites me about it and why it's up here is the sheer potential of it. We've seen already Ncuti Gatwa's Doctor adds a jukebox to the TARDIS, and we heard him say that it needs a chair. So this is one of those consoles that I don't think is going to stay just like this. I think it will evolve and adapt over time, and it is definitely the most versatile, definitely the biggest looking console. I love that it's got ramps, obviously as a disabled person I love that. I know that like the classic Who TARDISes are accessible as well, but there's just something about keeping the levels whilst it also is all accessible that's great. I know some people think that this is a bit too clinical, but I think that will change with the different colours and different furniture that eventually will get added and already has started to be added. If that never happens, then maybe in retrospect I'll knock this console down a few notches, but personally for me, it's perfect. It's exactly what I wanted for a modern TARDIS. A perfect blend of classic and new Who design elements that really, really just works. And you can really feel the budget that's gone into it. I love the time rotor, once again being a sky-high one, and I love the petal shape of the time rotor. And in fact, they say in the behind the scenes that these petals open and close with the dematerialization, which is really cool and very much solves the issue I had with some of the previous New Who consoles, where it doesn't really look like it's doing much at the column bit when it's dematerializing and rematerializing, whereas with the classic Who consoles, you have the bobbing up and down effect. You don't really get that as much with New Who consoles, but this seems like a really good way of kind of circumventing that problem in also a very unique way. Frankly, we've only had this TARDIS for 3 episodes, and it's been a joy whenever I've got to see it. I absolutely love this thing. I know I said that the McGann TARDIS would be the one I'd want to spend the most time in, but if I had to pick a default TARDIS, it would probably be this one. The McGann one would be like my relaxed time, you know, like my study kind of thing. But like, this would be, if I want to go out on an adventure and I'm feeling ready for action, this is the TARDIS I would use. There's just such an element of excitement and vastness to it that just fits the TARDIS perfectly. And it's exactly the kind of thing that I've always imagined the TARDIS looking like when you ever look at concept art of massive TARDIS interiors. And you're like, oh, that'd be great, but they'll never have the budget to do it. That's almost quite literally what this console is. It's the sort of thing where I imagine if the 60s team looked at it, they'd go, this is exactly what we envisioned, but obviously to the nth degree. And I love it for that. I genuinely adore this console. It's my number one. And yeah, it feels good to say that. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. What's your favourite TARDIS interior? Like the video if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you later.